And so I spent a lot of my childhood both terrified about racism, living the effects of the racism that my father suffered, and going to shopping centers with my dad where people would try and take me from him because they assumed that he was kidnapping a white child. So racism is something that I've lived in my family, and is something that in the towns that I came from was a very complicated and very difficult issue. And I think it's part of why coming back to California is always both powerful to me and evocative in a way that I find unexpected, like listening to the trains come through town. And I spent a lot of my life in trailers listening to those trains come through Central Valley towns. So it's very evocative for me to be here. And also odd to see how California has become a place where the places that I mentioned are often now suburbs rather than farm communities or small towns. And what it means for those places to still exist but be so transformed, because California is basically a country, as far as I can tell, not a state, even though it's in the union and everything, but let's not kid ourselves. And so coming back here is always powerful to me because it makes me remember things kind of in my body, through smell and sound, and driving last night from the airport and parts of the landscape still being farmland, and seeing it and recognizing it. And so it matters to me to be here and to recognize what a terrible year you've had in California and on this campus. The kinds of draconian measures that are happening to public education in this state are profoundly disturbing and enormously upsetting. And I know that there has been a lot of activism on this campus this year in response to that, as well as many other issues. And I want to name it because I think also coming as a kind of poor queer woman from this state, one of the few things that I remember very well was that there was maybe the possibility, maybe, that you could go to school if you graduated from high school. It wasn't simple, and nobody said automatically it was going to happen. But there was actually a way that you could consider going to a junior college and going from a junior college or a technical training program into a state university, and those state universities really having capacity. They were not dumping grounds. And the model that California created for public education is still one of the most significant models, I think, for public education in America. So the fact that there's a real struggle to try and take it apart is very painful to me, because I think that it's a model of hope for communities that are marginalized, people that are poor, who want the opportunity of having a future that might be different than where we come from. My parents, I was the first person in my family to graduate from high school. And for my family, even that was a remarkable feat. Both my parents had dropped out of high school. My mother had her first child at 15. My dad dropped out of school at 15. My mother lost her first child by the time she was 16. And they lived a poor life because they didn't have a future. Much of it determined both by their racial and class background, but also because by the time they could figure it out, they felt they were too old to be able to access that system. Now I have to say that the good news isn't always bad news, is that when my parents were in their 40s or 50s. My father went back and finished high school. And the person that he was doing night school with, I mean, he was working full-time as a carpenter, was a guy that taught at Simon Fraser University, which was just opening in British Columbia. And my parents decided to sell everything they owned and drag a trailer to Canada, and my dad went to college. And he ended up with a PhD in China studies, and my mother helped start the women's movement in Canada. So education is a really transformative thing, and I've seen it in my own family, but I mostly in my own family see the impact of not having it. But California is a place where, I put this down, this thing keeps sliding all over the place, a place where education and the model for education was taken very seriously in terms of class and race. That was precisely what the model was set up to address. Now, did it do it imperfectly? Yeah. But was it actually a structure that took on the question of access in a really explicit way? It was. And so the fact that this year is so shaped around what has happened, the March 4th events, the things that have happened on this campus mean a great deal to me because it is a model that I think should not be taken for granted at all. And when those models are taken apart, they don't get put back together. They just don't. You know, they don't, it's like, oh, next year we'll vote in a new set of people and then we'll fix it. That's not exactly what happens with privatization. So I want to, that's the context for me thinking about tonight's talk. And I want to also talk to you about what a history like my own means. I think of that history as a history of refusing not to remember. Most of the people that come from backgrounds like myself try and hide those backgrounds, try and learn new languages, try and pass. And I understand completely why that is. I don't think that that's a betrayal. But I do think that it's very difficult to live your life with the secret of your own background being something that you don't disclose because the racial, class, and economic history of your own family makes it impossible for you to talk with any sense of dignity in the places that you want to be able to access. When you come from that kind of history of trailer parks, rural backgrounds, you're a queer femme, you're sexually deviant, you want the wrong people and you're the wrong kind of lesbian, that shapes and frames your understanding of the world. For me, because of my background and the accident of my age, so that I came out or came kind of into activism accidentally, but at a moment when activism was the core value for young people. And the late 60s and 70s was really a moment that exploded, where everybody was trying to leave campus and not go to school, rather than get there and hope that they could still get a degree and afford it. So I got very lucky because it opened up the 60s and the 70s for me the opportunity to have an intellectual life, to have a life of art, of culture, of poetry, and of activism, because that was what was occurring everywhere that I looked. And I had a very strong feeling about that kind of activism from the very beginning, though I want to say really clearly that it was a very awkward relationship that I had to social justice work for many of the years that I was beginning that work. I didn't have the language, I didn't have the background. That history really does impact the way that you sound, the stories you tell that you think are really clever, that turn out to reveal something about yourself you never meant to reveal. And